The last time the world looked like this economically, it collapsed. The Great Depression didn't start with chaos, it started with denial. And today, the warning signs are back. Are we prepared, or are we sleepwalking into disaster? Let's find out. What if I told you that almost everything happening in the economy right now has happened before? And last time it happened, it destroyed the lives of an entire generation. I'm talking about the Great Depression, the biggest economic disaster in modern history. And the scary part is that the warning signs we're seeing today look almost identical to what people saw in 1929, right before everything fell apart. But here's what nobody wants to tell you. The people who saw those warning signs back then were ignored. They were called crazy. They were told the economy was fine, that everything was under control. And then one day, without any warning for most people, the whole thing came crashing down. Banks failed, businesses closed, millions of people lost everything, and the suffering lasted for over a decade. So the question I want to answer today is simple but terrifying. Are we about to repeat that same mistake? Are we standing on the edge of another collapse and just don't realize it? Now, before we can understand whether we're heading toward another 1929, we need to actually understand what happened in 1929. Because most people have heard about the Great Depression. They know it was bad, but they don't really understand how it happened or why. And if you don't understand the why, you can't recognize the warning signs when they show up again. So let me take you back to the 1920s. This decade has a nickname. They call it the Roaring Twenties, and that name tells you a lot about what was happening. America was roaring. The economy was booming. People were making money like never before. New technologies were changing everything. Cars were becoming common. Radios were in every home. Electricity was spreading across the country. It felt like the future had arrived, and it was going to be amazing forever. After World War I ended in 1918, America found itself in a unique position. Europe was destroyed. The countries that had been major economic powers were now dealing with destroyed cities, dead soldiers, and massive debts. But America hadn't fought the war on its own soil. American factories were intact. American workers were alive. And suddenly, America was the only country that could produce the goods that the entire world needed. This created a massive economic boom. American factories ran around the clock. American businesses expanded rapidly. American workers had jobs and money to spend. And that spending created even more business, which created even more jobs, which created even more spending. It was a beautiful cycle of growth that seemed like it would never end. But here's where the problems started to form. Problems that nobody wanted to talk about because everyone was too busy making money. The first problem was inequality. Yes, the economy was growing, but the growth wasn't being shared equally. The people at the top were getting incredibly rich, while the people at the bottom were barely getting by. In 1929, the top 1% of Americans owned about 40% of all the wealth in the country. The bottom 90% owned less than 20% combined. That's a massive gap. Why does this matter? Because when most of the money is concentrated at the top, the people at the bottom can't afford to buy things. And if people can't buy things, businesses can't sell things. And if businesses can't sell things, the whole economy starts to slow down. But in the 1920s, businesses found a way around this problem. They invented something that would become both a blessing and a curse. They invented easy credit. For the first time in history, regular people could buy things they couldn't actually afford. Want a car but don't have the money? No problem. Pay a little bit now and the rest later. Want a radio, a refrigerator, a new piece of furniture? Just sign here and you can have it today and pay for it over time. This seemed like a miracle. Suddenly, people who had never been able to afford nice things could have them. Sales went through the roof. Businesses made more money than ever. The economy kept booming. But there was a hidden danger here. All this buying wasn't based on real wealth. It was based on debt. People were spending money they didn't actually have, betting that they would have it in the future. And as long as the economy kept growing and everyone kept their jobs, this worked fine. But what would happen if the economy stopped growing? What would happen if people lost their jobs and couldn't pay their debts? Nobody wanted to think about that. The party was too good. The second problem was speculation. And this is where the stock market comes in. During the 1920s, more Americans than ever before started investing in stocks. Before this, the stock market was mostly for rich people and professional investors. Regular workers didn't really participate. But in the 20s, something changed. Regular people started thinking they could get rich by buying stocks. And for a while, they were right. Stock prices kept going up and up and up. If you bought stocks in 1925, by 1929, they might be worth 3 or 4 times what you paid. People were making fortunes literally overnight. A factory worker might invest his savings and within a year have enough to buy a house. Stories spread about ordinary people becoming millionaires. This created a frenzy. Everyone wanted in. People who knew nothing about business or finance were throwing their money into the stock market. They didn't care what companies they were buying or whether those companies were actually profitable. They just knew that stock prices kept going up and they wanted to be part of it. And here's where it gets really dangerous. People didn't just invest their own money. They borrowed money to invest. This is called buying on margin. It works like this. Let's say you have $100. You could just buy buy $100 worth of stocks. Or you could borrow $900 from your broker, add it to your $100, and buy $1,000 worth of stocks. If the stocks went up 10%, you wouldn't just make $10 on your original $100. You'd make $100 on your $1,000 investment. That's 100% return on your actual money. It seemed like a way to get rich fast, but buying on margin is incredibly risky, because if the stocks go down instead of up, you don't just lose your own money. You lose the borrowed money too, and you still owe that money to the broker. If stocks drop 10%, you don't just lose $10, you lose your entire $100 investment. And if they drop more than 10%, you actually owe money. By 1929, margin buying had reached insane levels. Billions of dollars had been borrowed to buy stocks. The entire market was basically a giant pile of debt dressed up to look like wealth. The third problem was overproduction. American factories had become incredibly efficient during the 20s. They could produce more goods than ever before. Cars, radios, appliances, clothes, food. American industry was a production machine, but there's a limit to how much stuff people can buy. Eventually, everyone who wanted a car had a car. Everyone who wanted a radio had a radio. And when people stop buying, factories have to slow down. When factories slow down, they lay off workers. And when workers get laid off, they have even less money to buy things, which means factories have to slow down even more. By 1929, American warehouses were filling up with unsold goods. Factories were starting to cut back, but the stock market didn't reflect this reality at all. Stock prices kept climbing even as the real economy was starting to weaken underneath. The fourth problem was a lack of regulation. The stock market in the 1920s was basically the Wild West. There were almost no rules. Companies could lie about their finances. Insiders could manipulate prices. Brokers could make up whatever terms they wanted. Nobody was watching. Nobody was protecting ordinary investors from fraud and manipulation, and people took full advantage of this. There were schemes within schemes. Pools of investors would secretly buy up a stock, spread rumors to drive the price higher, and then sell to unsuspecting buyers who didn't know the price had been artificially inflated. By the time regular people bought in, the insiders had already taken their profits and left. The fifth problem was arrogance, and maybe this was the biggest problem of all. By 1929, people genuinely believed that the economy had entered a new era, a permanent era of growth. They thought that the old rules no longer applied, that crashes were a thing of the past, that American prosperity would last forever. There's a famous quote from a Yale economist named Irving Fisher. Just days before the crash, he declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. He was considered one of the smartest economists in the country, and he was completely, catastrophically wrong. This kind of overconfidence is dangerous because it blinds people to risks. When you believe that nothing can go wrong, you stop preparing for things to go wrong. You take bigger and bigger risks because you don't think you'll ever have to pay the price. So by September of 1929, all these problems had been building up for years. Wealth inequality, massive debt from easy credit, stock market speculation fueled by margin buying, overproduction in factories, a total lack of regulation, and widespread arrogance that everything was fine and would stay fine forever. It was a bomb waiting to explode. All it needed was a spark. The spark came in October. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, something strange happened at the New York Stock Exchange. The market opened normally enough, but then prices started dropping, not gradually, rapidly. Within the first hour, millions of shares changed hands as panicked investors tried to sell. This day became known as Black Thursday. It wasn't the worst day of the crash, but it was the day that people started realizing something was very wrong. Here's what happened. As prices dropped, people who had bought stocks on margin got what's called a margin call. Their brokers told them they needed to put up more money to cover their loans. But most of these people didn't have more money. They had already borrowed everything they could, so they had only one choice: sell their stocks right now, at whatever price they could get. This created a chain reaction. When people started selling to cover their margin calls, it pushed prices down even more, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling, which pushed prices down even more. It was a downward spiral that fed on itself. On Black Thursday, the big banks tried to stop the bleeding. A group of powerful bankers got together and agreed to buy stocks to prop up prices. And for a moment it worked. Prices stabilized. People thought maybe the worst was over. They were wrong. The following Monday, October 28, the selling resumed with even more force. Prices plunged. And then came Tuesday, October 29, Black Tuesday, the worst day in stock market history up to that point. On Black Tuesday, 16 million shares were traded. That was an unimaginable number for the time. The trading systems couldn't even keep up. Ticker machines that reported prices fell hours behind. People had no idea what was happening to their investments because the information couldn't be transmitted fast enough. The chaos was total. Crowds gathered outside the stock exchange. Police had to be called to control the mobs. Rumors spread that ruined investors were jumping out of windows, though most of these stories were exaggerated or made up. By the end of Black Tuesday, the stock market had lost 12% of its value in a single day. day. Billions of dollars evaporated. Paper fortunes disappeared. And this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks and months, the market continued to fall and fall and fall. By the time it finally hit bottom in 1932, the stock market had lost about 90% of its peak value. 90%. If you had invested $1,000 at the market's peak in 1929, by 1932, it was worth about $100. But the stock market crash was only the first domino. Remember all those people who had bought things on credit? All those loans for cars and radios and refrigerators. When people lost their jobs and couldn't pay their debts, the businesses that had extended credit started failing. And when those businesses failed, their employees lost their jobs too. And those employees couldn't pay their debts either. The spiral just kept going down. And then came the banks. Banks in the 1920s didn't have the protections we have today. There was no federal insurance on deposits. If a bank failed, people simply lost all their money. Everything they had saved was just gone. And banks started failing by the thousands. Between 1930 and 1933, about 9,000 American banks went out of business. That's not a typo. 9,000. People who had worked their entire lives, saved carefully, done everything right, woke up one morning to find out that their life savings had vanished. This caused bank runs. People would hear rumors that their bank might be in trouble, and they would rush to withdraw their money before it was too late. But banks don't actually keep all their money in the vault. They loan most of it out. So when everyone tries to withdraw at once, the bank runs out of cash and has to close, which means everyone who didn't get there fast enough loses everything. The fear was constant. You might have money in the bank today. Tomorrow it could be gone. There was no safety, no security, no trust in the system. By 1933, unemployment had reached 25%. 1 in 4 American workers couldn't find a job. And those numbers don't even capture the full picture. Many people who still had jobs had their hours cut or their wages reduced. Farmers couldn't sell their crops at prices high enough to cover their costs. In the cities, bread lines stretched around blocks as people waited for a free meal. The human suffering was immense. Families lost their homes and ended up living in shantytowns made of cardboard and scrap metal. They called these places Hoovervilles, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, who many people blamed for the crisis. Children went hungry. People froze in the winter. Suicide rates climbed. The American dream seemed like a cruel joke, and it lasted for years. The Great Depression didn't end quickly. It dragged on through the 1930s. Recovery was slow and painful. In many ways, it didn't really end until World War II, when massive government spending on the war effort finally got the economy moving again. So that's what happened in 1929 and after. That's the full picture of the Great Depression. The buildup, the crash, the aftermath. Now here comes the scary part. Let's look at today and see how many of these same warning signs are showing up. The first parallel is wealth inequality. Remember how in 1929, the top 1% owned about 40% of all wealth? Well, today the situation is actually worse. According to recent data, the top 1% in America now owns more wealth than the entire middle class combined. The wealth gap has been growing for decades and shows no signs of slowing down. Just like in the 1920s, the economy is growing, but most people aren't feeling it. Corporate profits are at record highs. Stock markets have been at record highs. But for regular working people, wages have barely kept up with inflation. Housing costs have exploded. Healthcare costs have exploded. Education costs have exploded. And despite working full-time, many Americans can barely afford to live. This creates the same fundamental problem that existed in the 1920s. When most people don't have extra money to spend, the economy becomes fragile. It depends on the wealthy to keep spending. And if they stop or if something spooks them, there's not enough demand from regular consumers to keep things going. The second parallel is debt. American household debt is at all-time highs. Credit card debt, student loan debt, auto loans, mortgages. People are borrowing more money than ever before just to maintain their standard of living. And it's not just consumers. Corporate debt is also at record levels. Companies have borrowed trillions of dollars, often at very low interest rates. Many of these companies aren't actually profitable. They're what economists call zombie companies. They only survive because they can keep borrowing. If interest rates rise or if lenders get nervous, these companies will fail. The government itself has also accumulated massive debt. The national debt is now over $30 trillion and climbing rapidly. This limits the government's ability to respond to a crisis. If the economy crashes, can the government afford another massive bailout, or has it already spent too much? Just like the easy credit of the 1920s created hidden vulnerabilities, today's debt creates hidden vulnerabilities. Everything works fine as long as people can keep making their payments. But what happens when they can't? The third parallel is speculation. The stock market over the past several years has gone crazy. Not just normal growth, crazy growth. Companies with no profits and questionable business models have seen their stock prices multiply by 5 or 10 or 20 times. Remember meme stocks? GameStop, AMC. Regular people piled into these stocks not because the companies were doing well, but because they thought prices would keep going up. They were gambling. gambling. Some made money, many lost everything. And then there's cryptocurrency. Bitcoin and thousands of other digital currencies have seen wild swings in value. Some people became millionaires. Others lost their life savings when prices crashed. The crypto market has all the same characteristics as the stock speculation of the 1920s. People buying things they don't understand, borrowing money to make bigger bets, convinced that prices will keep rising forever. The amount of margin debt in today's market is also at record levels. Just like in 1929, people are borrowing money to buy stocks. And just like in 1929, this creates the potential for a chain reaction when prices start falling. The fourth parallel is a bubble mentality. In the 1920s, people believed in the new era. They thought the old rules didn't apply anymore. They thought prosperity was permanent. In recent years, we've seen the same kind of thinking. People convinced that certain investments can only go up, that technology companies will grow forever, that real estate prices will never fall, that central banks have figured out how to prevent recessions. Every time prices fall significantly, central banks step in with more money, more stimulus, more support. This has trained investors to believe that they can never really lose. If things get bad, the government will bail them out. This is incredibly dangerous thinking. It encourages people to take risks they shouldn't take. It creates a false sense of security. And when something finally happens that the government can't or won't fix, people are completely unprepared. The fifth parallel is overconfidence. Just like Irving Fisher declaring stocks had reached a permanently high plateau, we have experts today telling us everything is fine. The economy is strong. Inflation is under control. The banking system is solid. But we've heard these assurances before. Right before the 2008 financial crisis, experts told us that housing prices could never fall nationally, that the banking system was well regulated and safe, that the complex financial instruments they had created actually reduced risk. They were wrong, and millions of people suffered because of that wrong assessment. So how do we know the experts aren't wrong again? How do we know that the assurances we're hearing today aren't just as misguided as the assurances people heard in 1929 or 2007? The honest answer is that we don't know. Nobody can predict exactly when a crash will happen or exactly what will trigger it. But we can look at the vulnerabilities, we can look at the warning signs, and we can recognize that the conditions for a major crash exist today just as they existed in 1929. But here's where today might actually be different, and not necessarily in a good way. One major difference is the size and complexity of the global financial system. In 1929, the American economy was relatively simple compared to today. Banks were local. Financial products were straightforward. Information traveled slowly. Today, the global financial system is incredibly complex. Banks operate across borders. Financial products are so complicated that even the people selling them don't fully understand them. Trillions of dollars move around the world in milliseconds. This complexity creates new kinds of risks. In 1929, a problem in one part of the economy took time to spread to other parts. Today, a problem anywhere in the world can spread everywhere almost instantly. A bank failure in Europe could crash stock markets in Asia within hours. A political crisis in one country could trigger a global panic before anyone has time to respond. Another difference is technology. High-frequency trading now accounts for a large portion of stock market activity. These are computer programs that buy and sell stocks in fractions of a second. They can amplify both gains and losses far beyond what human traders could do. We've already seen what can happen when these systems go wrong. Flash crashes where markets plunge dramatically in minutes, only to recover just as quickly. But what if a flash crash happened at the wrong time, during a period of heightened fear, and the recovery didn't come? Another difference is the interconnectedness of the global economy. In 1929, what happened in America affected other countries, but many economies were still relatively separate. Today, supply chains stretch around the world. Companies depend on components and materials from dozens of countries. A disruption anywhere can create shortages everywhere. We saw this during the pandemic when supply chains broke down. Ships sat at ports. Shelves went empty. Prices spiked. And that was with governments spending trillions of dollars to keep things going. What would happen without that support? Another difference is central bank intervention. In 1929, central banks like the Federal Reserve actually made things worse by tightening money supply when they should have been loosening it. We've learned from that mistake. Modern central banks know how to inject money into the economy during a crisis, but this creates its own problem. Central banks have been pumping money into the economy for years now. Interest rates were kept near zero for over a decade after the 2008 crisis. Trillions of dollars were created through quantitative easing. This money has inflated asset prices and allowed debts to grow that would otherwise be unsustainable. What happens when inflation forces central banks to stop pumping money? What happens when they have to actually raise interest rates and shrink the money supply? All those zombie companies suddenly can't afford their debts. All those inflated asset prices start to fall. All those over-leveraged investors get margin calls. We're already seeing some of this. Central banks have been raising interest interest rates to fight inflation. Banks have started failing. Real estate prices have started falling in some areas. The question is whether this is just a normal adjustment or the beginning of something much worse. So what would a modern crash actually look like? It probably wouldn't look exactly like 1929. We wouldn't have ticker machines running hours behind. We wouldn't have crowds gathering outside the stock exchange. But the fundamental dynamics would be the same. It would likely start with some kind of trigger event. Maybe a major bank failure. Maybe a geopolitical crisis. Maybe a sudden realization that some major asset is worth far less than everyone thought. It could be something that seems small at first but quickly spirals out of control. From there, the selling would start. Not just in one market but across all markets. Stocks, bonds, real estate, crypto, everything would drop at once as investors tried to get to cash. The computer algorithms would make it faster and more violent than any crash in history. What took weeks in 1929 might happen in days or even hours today. Central banks would try to respond. They would cut interest rates. They would inject money. But if inflation is still high, their options are limited. Every time they pump more money in, they risk making inflation worse. It's a terrible choice between letting the economy crash and destroying the currency. Governments would try to pass emergency measures, bailouts, stimulus checks, maybe even price controls, but the political system moves slowly. By the time politicians agree on what to do, months might have passed and the damage might already be done. For regular people, the impact would be felt in concrete ways. Job losses, falling home values, retirement accounts wiped out, businesses closing, price increases on essential goods. The feeling of financial security that many people take for granted would evaporate. And unlike the pandemic, where there was hope that things would return to normal once the virus was under control, an economic depression doesn't have a clear endpoint. It lasts as long as it takes to work through all the problems. The Great Depression lasted a decade. A modern version could be just as long or even longer. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying a crash is definitely going to happen. Nobody knows for sure what the future holds. There are smart people who think the economy is fundamentally sound and that the risks are manageable. There are other smart people who think we're heading for disaster. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What I am saying is that the risks are real. The warning signs are there. And ignoring them because everything seems fine right now would be a mistake. Things seemed fine in 1929 too, right up until they weren't. So what can ordinary people do to protect themselves? The first thing is to get educated. Understand how the economy works. Understand where your money is. Understand what risks you're exposed to. Knowledge is protection. The second thing is to reduce unnecessary debt. If a crash comes, the people who will suffer most are those with large debts they can't pay. Credit card debt, car loans. If you can pay these off, you're in a much stronger position. The third thing is to build an emergency fund. Having cash saved gives you options. If you lose your job, you have time to find a new one without panicking. If prices spike, you can still buy what you need. Cash is safety. The fourth thing is to diversify. Don't put all your money in one thing. Not all in stocks, not all in real estate, not all in crypto. Spread it around so that if one thing crashes, you're not completely wiped out. The fifth thing is to be skeptical of easy money. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. High returns always come with high risks. The people who get destroyed in crashes are usually the ones who were chasing the highest returns without understanding the dangers. And the sixth thing is to pay attention. Watch what's happening in the economy. Not the day-to-day noise, but the bigger trends. Are debts growing unsustainably? Are asset prices looking inflated? Are people taking crazy risks? When everyone around you is saying everything is fine and nothing can go wrong, that's exactly when you should be most worried. The hardest thing about preparing for a crash is that you never know when it's coming. It might be next month. It might be next year. It might be 5 years from now. Or maybe we'll get lucky and it won't happen at all. But the people who prepare are the ones who survive. The people who ignore the warning signs are the ones who suffer the most. In 1929, there were people who saw the crash coming. They sold their stocks. They moved to cash. They protected their families. While everyone around them was losing everything, they came through relatively unscathed. And when prices finally hit bottom, they were able to buy assets for pennies on the dollar and rebuild their wealth. Those people weren't smarter than everyone else. They just paid attention. They saw the warning signs that others wanted to ignore. And they had the courage to act even when everyone was telling them they were crazy. That's the lesson of 1929 that applies today. Pay attention. Think for yourself. Don't assume that just because experts say everything is fine, everything actually is fine. Be prepared for the possibility that things could go very wrong very quickly. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that the crashes always come eventually. The only question is whether you're ready when they do. Looking at all the evidence, all the parallels, all the warning signs, I can't tell you with certainty what's going to happen next. Nobody can. But I can tell you that the conditions for a major economic crisis exist today. The inequality, the debt, the speculation, the overconfidence, it's all there. Just like it was in 1929. Does that mean we're definitely heading for another Great Depression? Not necessarily. There are also differences that might help us avoid the worst outcomes. Better regulations, smarter central banks, lessons learned from past crises, but hoping for the best isn't a strategy. Smart people prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. They don't assume everything will work out. They make sure they're protected if it doesn't. The Roaring Twenties felt incredible to the people living through them. They couldn't imagine it ever ending. And then suddenly, brutally, it did end. And the hangover lasted for over a decade. We've been living through our own kind of Roaring Twenties. Years of growth and rising prices and easy money. It's felt incredible to the people benefiting from it. But all parties eventually end. The question is whether we're smart enough this time to prepare for the morning after. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make you think, to look at the patterns, to understand that history doesn't repeat exactly, but it often rhymes. And the rhymes between then and now are getting louder and harder to ignore. The economy is complicated. Nobody has all the answers. But the people who study these things, who look at the data, who understand the cycles, many of them are worried. Not panicking, but worried. And when the experts are worried, maybe we should pay attention. Whatever happens next, whether we avoid a crash or walk right into one, the principles remain the same. Reduce debt, build savings, diversify investments, stay informed, be skeptical of easy answers and promises that nothing can go wrong. These principles work whether the economy booms or crashes. They're just more important when the risks are high, and the risks right now look pretty high to me. So are we about to repeat 1929? I don't know, but I know the warning signs are there. I know the vulnerabilities exist, and I know that the people who ignore history are usually the ones who end up repeating it. Take that information and do what you think is right with it. But at least now you know. You can't say you weren't warned. If you want to understand more about how economic forces shape our world, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.